Hi everyone, my name is Courtney and welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be discussing all the books that I read in the month of August. If you see my Pokemon plush, this is Waffle. I'm holding her because if I hold her, I'm thinking maybe I'll stop touching the table in front of me as much and maybe we'll get less of the popping sound because I think that's just me touching things. So I'm trying to touch the table and the mic less to avoid that. But let's get into what I read in August. It was a somewhat productive month. I'm putting out videos that I'm really excited about, working on a lot of projects that I'm excited about, which does impede some of my reading, but also I'm kind of slumpy, so I haven't been reading a lot, but I was still able to read 5 books, but none of them are physical reads. They are all library checkouts this month, and that's because this month I was reading specifically to finish and work on projects. If you don't know, the big project that I've been working on is my Goodreads series, where I am reviewing and discussing the Goodreads achievements and completing said achievements. And so this month was really dedicated to working on those challenges. It's not quite the end of the month, but basically what I'm going to be reading throughout the rest of the month to finish up this month is going to be books for that, as well as preparing for my month-long reading challenge of the Magical Readathon, which is going on next month, which I'm participating in, which I hope to get back into my TBR reading for. I started out this month by reading that was not part of my Goodreads challenges. I wanted a short novella to tide me over until some library holds came through, and I ended up picking Remote Control by Ndendi Okorafor. Ended up being really bad optics for me because basically 2 days after I finished this book, Ndendi Okorafor started to get in a little bit of controversy. Basically, if you aren't in the know, Ndendi Okorafor was asked on Twitter, maybe it was Thread, I'm not sure, I believe it was Twitter though. She was basically asked about an upcoming book. An Indigenous reader was like, hey, I know this next book has owls in it, would you mind telling me about the owl usage, because owls are something sacred to my culture and I need to know if this is something I can read or if it's going to be something I would rather not read. And this was a fan of Ndendi Okorafor's. They had, I think, previously read a lot of their works, and Ndendi Okorafor responded a little bit dismissively, I would say. I have never talked about how I feel about trigger warnings. To me, as an avid AO3 user, I'm very much on the side of the artist getting to decide if they want to be a work that has trigger warnings at the front of their work or if they decide not to put trigger warnings in the front of their book. I would rather the author care about trigger and content warnings and put them in instead of putting them in disingenuously. That's where you get a lot of content warnings that are just not very helpful and just kind of dismissive or just inappropriate. I've also heard talks from librarians that people are using content warnings and trigger warnings as ways to stop people from accessing books, as a way to know what books to ban. And in most cases, if a book or an author decides not to put content warnings in, there's websites, there's reviews that discuss those things. Triggerwarnings.com is the one I use to look up stuff. And so I'm kind of on the fence. I normally feel it's up to author discretion if that's something that they want to put in the book. But if someone is coming to you to ask a question, I feel like it is fine to tell the person or address the person with empathy and or DM the person privately and discuss it there if you are worried about spoilers or something. But that's my own opinion. But basically what went down, Twitter person asked for a content warning, Ndendi Okorafor was dismissive towards them, and then there was a lot of doubling down and anti-Indigenous rhetoric in her comment section that she apparently was liking or at least engaging with in some way. I believe Jess Owens discussed it in a Bookish Tea video on their channel. I think this situation is just very unfortunate, and my opinion that it was not handled appropriately, at least till this point. I don't know if she has rescinded any comments or made an apology. But as for Remote Control, it is a science fiction novel. It is set in a futuristic version of Ghana with a main character who seems to have otherworldly powers that are connected to death. I enjoyed the novel. I thought it was interesting. I have since liked Ndendi Okorafor's writing, but as of this incident, I probably won't be picking up anything more by them for now, which is unfortunate because I really was looking forward to Binti. Normally, I wouldn't discuss a book where an author has been doing things where I don't really want to monetarily or publicly support them, but I figured it was a good chance to let people know about stuff if they hadn't heard about that, so that people can make their own financial decisions, especially, of course, when you're on a social public platform, and I'm sure you're getting a lot just thrown at you at all times. I'm sure it's really difficult to be genuine online in a public-facing platform role, but just wasn't appropriate. But let's move on to the next books I read. So all 4 of these are going to be for my Goodreads challenges, which of course I'll discuss later in that video. But the first book I read was Nettle and Bone. I really wanted to read T. Kingfisher, and I've been looking for an opportunity to do so. Nettle and Bone has been at the top of my list of stuff by her that I've wanted to read. And this is a pretty short novel. It's not quite a novella, but it's a pretty short novel, and it's a standalone adult fantasy. We're in a fairy tale-esque setting, medieval-esque setting, and we are following a young woman who has been kind of living as a cloistered, like, priestess nun situation, and her sister is getting into a very abusive, difficult situation with a king. She feels like she needs to stop whatever's going on with that situation before she is fated to marry said king. This is definitely like a fairy tale mythology kind of based story. Specifically, I feel like it's making a call to Sleeping Beauty, except kind of told through the evil fairy godmother's perspective, slightly, kind of. I really enjoyed this. There's a little bit of a quest, there's a little bit of a found family and like a gathering of people to do this quest. I'm typically not someone that enjoys a lot of quest books. They tend to feel like a lot of like, go to this place, go to this place, go to this place, and formulaic in a way that isn't really fun. But this book I thought did the quest really, really well. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this group of characters. It's a pretty short novel, so I could have used a little bit more time, especially with the romance. But I liked the archetypes. I liked what was explored. I thought this was an interesting cast of characters, an interesting main character, and interesting character journey for her. It's an older female protagonist, which is nice to see. The only thing I wanted more of was I felt like the world building could have been a little bit more fleshed out. There's some interesting settings and places, and it just feels like they're kind of there just to be there versus being more fleshed out for the world itself. And again, there were like hints to things that were kind of going on politically and stuff, but we didn't really get a wider angle of that. So this is definitely like soft or low fantasy, very whimsical, very much about the characters. Had me really enjoying it, but I wanted a little bit more oomph. So I gave this like a 3.75 stars of 4 stars. I will say this is like the most immersed in a book I've been in for a really long time. So there is that. But I think it was the best book that I read this month. Going on to the next book I read Young Bright Women. This is by Jessica Knoll. And again, this was a book that I read for my Goodreads challenges. It's part of the mystery thrillers, which is not something I normally pick up. I picked this at random, so I had no idea what it was about, what I was getting into. I wouldn't call it mystery thriller. I would call it a literary fiction or general fiction with a more crime lens. Not really mystery thriller. It's definitely more crime. It almost feels like a documentary, which it probably was inspired by, because Young Bright Women is a story which is very much inspired by the Ted Bundy cases. We start off with a young woman in a sorority. The sorority has a break-in, and it evolves to be a much bigger case than just that. And then another woman gets involved, and these 2 women are working together to connect these 2 cases together. The second woman that's coming in had a relationship with our second POV character, and so it's partially in the present, which I think is supposed to be like the 70s, 80s, and then partially in the past, like 10 years before, with one of the first cases. And I give this like a 2.5 stars. It's just very middle of the road. I think it worked for me as a mystery thriller just because there weren't a lot of mystery thriller elements. It was very much crime documentary again. A lot of people do not like how this is based on the Ted Bundy cases, and I really just don't know how to feel about that. It feels a little bit weird because you could definitely tell that it was. Like, if you know just a little bit about Ted Bundy, you kind of can tell that this is based on that. I do like that it's focused on the women's stories and kind of trying to take away the mystique of the male serial killer, but I don't know if it was really successful with it in the end. And I think the thing that I disliked the most is that there is kind of a grotesque scene at the end of the story where you're seeing what happened to Ruth, or the one character's friend and lover. I just didn't think it was necessary. It didn't go into explicit detail about what happens to her, but I didn't think it was necessary what we did see. And then it kind of had me question like why we needed her perspective at all, if it was just kind of leading to like, you know, kind of a gruesome ending for her. I'm hearing a lot of weird things about Jessica Knoll's second book, so I probably won't be picking it up. This was fine. It was interesting in the moment. I definitely didn't have any problem like picking it up and reading it. It was engaging enough to keep reading, but not something I would typically pick up and not something that I feel the need to pick up anytime soon. So yeah, it was fine. The next book I picked up was Oathbound, which is the third book in a young adult fantasy series. The first one being Legend Born, of course, by Tracy Deonn. I felt very similarly to Oathbound that I felt to the entire series of Legend Born. There's a lot of elements I like, there's a lot I enjoy, but I think I have really kind of grown out of a lot of young adult fantasy books. So while I enjoyed this, I think it's kind of a 3-star, solid, good, would recommend, but just not something I'm super heavily invested in. But if you don't know, Legend Born is kind of a King Arthur retelling with our main character Bree, who's entering into the secret society as she joins a special high school collegiate program. Her mother passed away and she has a lot of trauma surrounding that, all the while she's discovering the world of magic. I really like what Tracy Deonn does with Bree and like her personal inner turmoil and struggle, especially with her mom and how it relates to magic and everything. I think she just makes really fascinating characters, and she makes really interesting side characters as well. I loved some of the new characters that we got introduced to this time around. Tracy Deonn is just always expanding this world, making it more interesting, more fleshed out, kind of problematizing things that we're introduced to in earlier books, making everything just more complex and more interesting. I will say though, I'm Selwyn or Sel hater. I'm sorry, I don't like him. I do think he's interesting. He's an interesting character, but I don't like him as a love interest. He can't be redeemed in my eyes for the things that he's done, mainly being kind of standing to the side and just kind of letting Bree deal with racism. But I really like Nick. I really like our new character Zoe and her brother. But overall, this series, again, it's solid, it's good, it's just not fantastic or great to me personally anymore. I felt that especially in this book because it's definitely a setup book. It definitely feels like we're setting up things for the end of the story, which the fourth book should be the final book in the series. I was interested, I was entertained, but it definitely felt like we were just going through events that are either characters learning or training to get to an end conclusion, or just like kind of setting up plot points or events that have no great purpose for this particular novel. In the second book, I do feel like the things that happened were things that had outcomes that affected the next book. Let me get into a spoiler right now, just so I can kind of make it clear. This third book is dealing with Bree having amnesia and kind of like giving away her memories and kind of training and like learning. That just lends itself to being a plot line where things are just kind of stagnant for the sake of getting to the next book in the series. So a lot of emotional work was done with Bree, but like things for the plot, not as much, because Bree isn't connected to the original Arthurian world anymore. So good, interesting. I was engaged. It's a really long book, so I give it that. But I don't know how much we actually progressed in this novel. Maybe not as much as I would have liked. But getting into our final novel, we have Blob by Maggie Su. Blob is a literary fiction book, general fiction book, I guess, where we have a main character who's kind of going through some life changes, has dropped out of college, has had a boyfriend break up with her, and just doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life, is just really struggling, probably with like depression or something. And she discovers this weird gelatinous thing outside of a bar and decides to take it home. It's kind of that whole event interacting with her and her life and just kind of like this traumatic turmoil that she's going through. I had a TikTok a couple months ago where someone was talking about how a lot of literary books are just like internal people dealing with like internal problems, self problems, a like 25-year-old or so dealing with like emotional meltdown. And now I can't like unsee it every time I read a literary fiction book. I haven't been reading a lot of literary fiction, so I feel like this is always just a palate cleanser when I do pick one up, but also like I can't get away from the idea that this is the topic that everybody's writing about, and everybody's just kind of doing their own spin on like the personal or sometimes artistic mind, having a meltdown, being kind of a shit person, and just like watching the spiral. And so I liked this. I read it fairly quickly. At the end of the day, I kind of feel like it was good. It was okay. Just kind of another 3-star for me. Haven't been reading tons of literary fiction, so this did feel enjoyable in that aspect because it did get my brain moving. I'm someone that thinks genre fiction can be just as powerful as literary fiction, just as thematic, but I haven't had one that's really like gotten its clutches into me recently. So while this like maybe wasn't my favorite book or the most enjoyable book, it did get my brain wheeling, kind of thinking about things, not just thinking of the craft of the book, but just thinking about the themes and what the author's trying to say. And like, this isn't the most in-depth literary fiction out there. So I think I just need to read more literary fiction because obviously I feel like my brain is kind of craving this. So that's what I've read so far, what I've completed. I am reading a couple more books at the moment. So I started reading House of Spirits, which is another literary fiction, classic fiction, magical realism, fabulous novel. And it's kind of following a family saga, kind of focused in on a couple characters, but it still feels like it's going to expand past them. I believe it takes place in Argentina over the turn of the century into like World War I, World War II so far. It's pretty bleak. I feel like everybody talks about the magical realism element and not about how bleak it is. It also just like has every slur that you could possibly think of in it. And I think people forget to talk about that. But again, this is another book where I haven't read a lot of classics in a while. I haven't read a lot of literary fiction in a while. I don't want to say enjoying it because again, it is pretty bleak. I think it's really interesting to kind of explore a moment in history that I don't know a lot about. Some stuff, but not a ton, in this like historical fiction lens. Because it's definitely using this family saga to kind of discuss like Argentinian politics at the time. So it's definitely interesting. It's very long, so I'm still gonna be reading it for a while, but there's that. And then I also tentatively started reading A Dark and Drowning Tide by Alison Shaft. This is an adult fantasy. It's sapphic and it's about two women that have to come together to save their professor. I haven't even gotten to that point. I'm barely 30 pages into it. 2 chapters I read or 3 chapters I've read I've really enjoyed, but I'm having a very hard time focusing. I really have to focus in if I want to get those books finished before we go into the next month of reading, because I have a lot that I want to be reading in the next month. How did I do reading wise? Read nothing on my TBR, read a couple things I've been interested in, but I was able to read a lot for my video projects, and I am, again, working on those video projects, putting a lot of time and effort into doing them and creating them, so it's kind of a give and take. I would love to know what you've been reading this month, what you've been enjoying, if you've had a better time than me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later, and happy reading!